participation in decision-making, legal certainty, avoidance of arbitrariness, and procedural and legal transparency. So there's a lot in the mix that the Secretary General has brought to the table. And all of these principles are supposed to assist us, not only at the state level, but also at the international level, to ensure that there's a level of democracy in decision-making, because the way in which he has described the rule of law in this paragraph is very much the rule of law in conjunction with democracy. So, you know, this is one of the problems that the international community have raised in respect of BRICS, for example. And I'll look at that a little bit later, that the countries are not necessarily democratic internally, but they're pushing for democracy in the international arena. I'll get back to that. So besides the statement of the Secretary General, the United Nations General Assembly has considered the rule of law as an official agenda item since 1992. Obviously, they discussed it before that, but official agenda item since 1992. There have been a number of resolutions adopted by UNGA in this regard, and of course, though, the General Assembly, there's not binding resolutions, but it's very important to see what's coming out of it, and it's very much along the lines of the definition that I've just shown to you, emanating from the Secretary General. The Security Council as well has held a number of thematic debates on the rule of law and adopted resolutions emphasizing the importance of these issues in the context of women, mainly in war situations, peace and security generally, children in armed conflict, and the protection of civilians in armed conflict. So obviously the argument of the Security Council in this regard would be that there should be, and there are, laws that exist, and these laws should then be taken into account and be adhered to when we look at situations such as women in conflict zones. So that is the approach of both UNGA and the Security Council. I'm just giving an overview. Then the members of states, next one. The members of states have also adopted a declaration of the rule of law at national and international levels. So what's important here is that the national level has also come into it, even though this is emanating from the United Nations. Here they state, we reaffirm our commitment to the rule of law and its fundamental importance for political dialogue and cooperation among all states, and for the further development of the three main pillars upon which the United Nations is built. And those three pillars are identified as international peace and security. The second pillar is human rights, and the third pillar is development. Although there has been a closer alignment between human rights and development, to the development of something that is now called the right to development, which I will also come back to. We agree that our collective response to the challenges and opportunities arising from the many complex political, social, and economic transformations before us must be guided by the rule of law. And then they state here it is the foundation of friendly and equitable relations between states. So the issue of equity is important in terms of this declaration. Of course, words are very important in declarations. And the basis on which just and fair societies are built. So there's an allusion to the internal mechanisms or machinations of states. And it's clear that the message is we need to ensure friendly and equitable relations among states, but states themselves also need to start adhering to this concept of the rule of law. And again, China is in fact starting to do that. Then the International Development Law Organization, and this is where human rights and development start coming together, have defined the rule of law as a culture and daily practice. They state that it is inseparable from equality, from access to justice, from education, from access to health and the protection of the most vulnerable. It is crucial for the viabilities of communities and nations and for the environment that sustains them. And a lot of this has been drawn into the Sustainable Development Goals post-2015 agenda. So issues around equality, access to justice, education, and health form a basis of this, and the issues around vulnerability, both globally and locally. So once again, they state there clearly that it relates to communities. I think they mean societies or states. And of course, environmental issues are very important in this regard, in particular when we look at the right to human development. But what I've tried to do in the next few slides is to highlight paragraphs where BRICS in their declarations have emphasized support for the rule of law, as well as support for the role of the United Nations, just as an indication that it's not as revolutionary a body as people assume it to be. And starting with 2009, that was the year before South Africa joined. South Africa joined BRICS in December of 2010. They were invited to join by China. It was given to President Zuma as a Christmas gift. He was informed on the 24th of December 2010 that South Africa was approved as a member of BRICS. So paragraph 12 of this declaration, for the first time then, states that we underline our support for more democratic and just multipolar world order based on the rule of international law, and this is repeated in almost every single declaration, based on the rule of international law, equality, mutual respect, cooperation, coordinated action, and collective decision-making of all states. And obviously this is then linked to the role that the United Nations plays, and that's in paragraph 14 of the same declaration, where BRICS expresses its strong commitment to multilateral diplomacy and the United Nations as a central player. So, and this is also repeated in every single declaration. You'll see there's a massive difference from the wording of the declarations in 2009 to the ones from UFA in 2015, in the sense that as each year's gone by, the declarations have become more wordy, more complex. At the beginning, you know, they were very clear, punchy statements, probably because the countries couldn't really find their footing with a lot of these issues. So they wanted to state it as clearly as possible. But as the declarations go on, they become more complex, they become wordier. But these two particular paragraphs are repeated almost verbatim in the other declarations. So that's Yekaterinburg. Then the next was in Brasilia, in Brazil in 2010. This is the first time that South Africa attended the Leadership Summit. Again, here moving up though in the order, which is also very important. Paragraph 2 from Brazil states our support for multipolar, equitable and democratic world order. So the issue of democracy in international relations comes in there. It must be based on international law, equality, mutual respect, exactly the same wording as in Yekaterinburg. And also the centrality of the United Nations comes through in paragraph 4. There are other mentions of the United Nations in the declarations, but the important thing that I want to highlight here is that the centrality of the United Nations is emphasized in every single declaration. Then next we go to Sanya in China. And here also the universally recognized norms of international law are mentioned in paragraph 7, and issues around mutual respect, collective decision-making, global economic governance. Here the wording has changed somewhat, and it's become a little bit more wordy in this regard, but democracy and international relations should be promoted. That's an important part of that particular paragraph. Again, the recognition of universally recognized norms of international law, as well as the need for democracy. So again, in paragraph 8, directly after that, strong commitment to the United Nations. Then on to New Delhi, paragraph 4. Again, few more concepts coming through here, but the issue there is, again, the recognition of universally recognized norms of international law and multilateral decision-making to deal with challenges and opportunities. And here they bring in, into the same paragraph, an important element of what BRICS is all about, and that is a strengthened representation of the emerging and developing countries in the institutions of global governance. This is very important to India, so they really hammered this home. They emphasized it. Democracy in terms of the decision-making and governance in international institutions. And that would include the IMF, the World Trade Organization, Security Council. Something that I didn't bring into this is, because it's an added layer of complexity, is the call for the reform of the United Nations Security Council. That is something that BRICS doesn't agree on. And this, in the declarations, is kind of like worded, we agree with the fact that the United Nations Security Council should be reformed. But then it's kind of like we support the aspirations of Brazil, India, and South Africa to become permanent members. So there's no direct support of the countries themselves, but more along the lines of the aspirations. And I think that Russia has made it very clear that they don't want to see the reform of processes. They don't want to see the reform of the veto in particular. So yes, sure, make the United Nations Security Council bigger, but you can't take the veto away from the Big Five. Then in paragraph 26, again, a strong commitment to the United Nations. The South African Leadership Summit was in eThekwini in Durban, and you can see some of South Africa's issues of importance coming through in the declaration. In paragraph 1, well, that's important, the very first paragraph of the declaration, reaffirm our commitment to the promotion of international law, multilateralism, and the central role of the United Nations. So obviously, the respect for the rule of law and the central role of the United Nations are very much related to one another. Then there's mentioned in the same paragraph, growing into BRICS solidarity, shared goal to contribute positively to global peace, stability, development, and cooperation. So everything is said in the very first paragraph. And then in paragraph 20, reiterated strong commitment to the United Nations, foremost multilateral forum entrusted with bringing about hope, peace, order, and sustainable development to the world. And it's emphasized that it enjoys universal membership and is at the center of global governance and multilateralism. And I think this emphasis is important, and also building up to the 70th anniversary of the establishment of the United Nations as well, which was recognized in the UFA declaration. So moving on to Fortaleza, Brazil, next declaration, paragraph 2 this time, not paragraph 1, but shared views and commitments to international law and multilateralism, the United Nations at the center and foundation, widely recognized, and then, you know, they just add more words to emphasize the importance of the United Nations and the role that the United Nations plays. And then here they mention the UN Charter, which is something that doesn't come across strongly in the previous declarations. So paragraph 24 looks at the importance of the international order based on the UN Charter. So not only on the UN itself, but on the charter that established the United Nations. In paragraph 25, the next paragraph in this declaration, you can see they're getting longer, reiterates our strong commitment to the UN as the fundamental multilateral organization entrusted with helping the international community maintain international peace and security. There's a difference in wording here, and I'm not sure how significant this is, but again, the centrality of the United Nations is recognized. And the first time human rights are mentioned in the BRICS declaration was in Fortaleza, paragraph 28. And this is something that Brazil was really pushing. We agree to continue to treat all human rights, including the right to development, in a fair and equal manner, on the same footing and with the same emphasis. So what was interesting here was they snuck the human rights agenda in by saying all rights should be treated equally, and the right to development was then foregrounded because this is a right that China feels comfortable with, that Russia feels comfortable with. So it's not only your first generation civil and political rights, but an emphasis on the right to development, but within the context of human rights. So the last declaration, of course, was UFA, and here, I mean, Russia really went to town with the wording in these paragraphs. So not necessarily more paragraphs, but certainly longer paragraphs. So here, in paragraph 4, the central role of the United Nations to find common solutions. Such challenges was the challenges that were mentioned previously, dealing with, just maintaining international peace and security. Then goes on, we expressed our intention to contribute to safeguarding a fair and equitable international order based on, again, the UN Charter. I think the emphasis on the UN Charter is important because these are the principles that were accepted for the United Nations to become the central multilateral organization. And sometimes people say that the United Nations, I haven't done enough work in this area, has strayed from its original mandate, which is contained in the Charter. So we fully avail ourselves of the potential of the organization as a forum for open and honest debate, coordination of global politics in order to prevent war and conflict, promote progress and development of humankind. So they're saying quite a lot here and not so much at the same time. They're just using a lot of words to emphasize the same thing. But the emphasis there is on issues related to war, to progress, and to development. Then in paragraph 6, quite strongly worded there, we insist that international law provides tools for achieving international justice based on principles of good faith and sovereign equality. By this, they're referring to, the sovereignty of states. This whole issue of non-interference, that's very important to China and Russia. Emphasize the need for universal adherence to principles and rules of international law in their interrelation and integrity, discarding the resource to double standards. There was a lot of fight around adding this into the declaration, but you could clearly see that Russia was pushing an agenda here because it was post-Crimea. And then we reaffirm our commitments to rigorous compliance with the Charter, so it's a repetition, and declaration on principles of international law concerning friendly relations and cooperation amongst states, and the Charter of the United Nations of 1970. So they really are focusing on the Charter, the original structure of the Charter and content of the Charter. Then in paragraph 10, also a lot of words, but here there hasn't been much of a deviation from what was stated in Fortaleza, in the sense that human rights is also mentioned in this declaration. Strengthening principles of equitable and mutually respectful cooperation of sovereign states. Sovereign states is mentioned many, many times. And then they state here, we will continue to treat all human rights, civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as the right to development, on the same footing and give them equal attention. And then they insist on a non-politicized human rights dialogue, including at the United Nations. So it's not very clear what is meant by a non-politicized human rights dialogue. But you can see there that there's very specific emphasis on equality of all rights. And then within the human rights institutions, to coordinate positions that deal with mutual interest. So that's just the paragraphs that I wanted to emphasize from the declarations to sort of hammer my point home, that BRICS has been looking at all the reforms that they are considering within the context of the rule of law and the United Nations itself. So some remarks that I would like to make based on this. Initially, the focus, if you read the entire declaration from Yekaterinburg, the first three declarations, the focus was on international finance and economics. There has not been an absolute shift, but the language in the summit declarations have developed to include political and governance issues much more strongly than before. I mean, initially there was an insistence that BRICS did not have a political agenda, but it's become clear that BRICS does indeed have a political agenda. So from the outset, from 2009, centrality of the UN and the rule of law has been mentioned in more than one paragraph, but the emphasis more pronounced in the last three summit declarations, with human rights mentioned in 2014 and 2015. Then lastly, the BRICS group understanding of the rule of law isn't spelled out clearly, but one would assume, based on the full grounding of the United Nations, that the definition of rule of law that's accepted by BRICS is the one that's emanating from the United Nations. One would argue that there are some elements that don't really feature very strongly, but at the same time, the centrality of the United Nations would suggest that BRICS has accepted the rule of law on that basis. So none of the proposals from any of the declarations or question the basic rules and norms that undergird today's global order. So the legitimacy of key institutions, such as the United Nations Security Council, are not questioned. So there's an acknowledgement that there needs to be reform, but there is no talk coming from the BRICS leaders that we want to be outside of the system. So the calls that BRICS makes for the reform of the Security Council, of the IMF, of the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization seem to be, not necessarily are, but seem to be based on a strengthening of the rule of law and creating more fair and democratic global governance institutions. So an emphasis on fairness and emphasis on democracy. And just a sort of throwaway thought from my side, because of where I come from, it would be important to set up cooperation amongst international lawyers within BRICS to ensure better interpretation and implementation of international law, because we may show commitments to international law and incorrectly interpret principles of international law. So that is all I wish to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. We have about 25 minutes for questions. So we will probably start with Pretoria first. And when you ask your question, please give us your name and your affiliation in your question as well. Also, for interest purposes, the seminar is being shown on our YouTube channel, and which you can access on the South African BRICS Think Tank website. Thank you. So do we have any questions in Pretoria? We have one question. We have two questions. Please start.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Prof, for a wonderful presentation. Now, I'm just curious. I don't know much about BRICS and the law part of things, but now I'm just curious to know. There's on the presentation where you talked about increasing access to development. So, I'm curious to know, how do they plan to increase access to development, and what kind of development, and in which context? And also, were you mentioning the issue of non-political human rights, and also now the BRICS having included a political agenda. I wonder, how do those two work in the framework of BRICS and their development or the goals that they wish to achieve? Thank you, Chairperson. And my name is Balazar Khejani. I'm a research specialist in the Africa Institute of South Africa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can we please have our second question?
Thank you. My name is Sylvester. With HSRC ISA. I have a comment in the question. The question is, how do you think the BRICS political agenda can be synchronized to translate into local political agenda, especially when there is this emphasis of non-interference in issues of sovereignty within member states? Then my comment is, I stated this position sometime 4 weeks back in Addis Ababa, when we were talking about the African Union and the African standby force and its readiness to drive peace and security on the continent. And especially talking about this idea of norm stating and revisionist positions of these new emerging powers. The radical position I stated, not in a negative sense, but in a very positive sense, was that, and which I state today in terms of the BRICS role. I feel that we are only flexing the muscles of the superpowers. We are not ready yet to change the norms and the rules and to call the shots, especially that we in the developing world, we are dependent on those very same countries, Russia, China, the US, in terms of funding. These are the countries that inject a lot of funding into the UN. And again from the declarations, there is an emphasis of the centrality of the UN, and that we are going to support the UN. And then the UN is funded by these very same countries, by these very same powers. So, I think it's a matter of rhetoric. Just we are talking that we are beginning to find a fair ground. But as long as these countries maintain the funding of the UN, we are going to, experience the same, global relations of power and control and development.
Thank you. Should I give you an opportunity to answer those before we go to the next place? Thanks.
Thank you very much to both of you for your questions. Palisa, with regards to the rights to development and access to development, because that's part of it. I think that the Sustainable Development Goals post-2015 are a good illustration of how the member states, and I think all of them, perceive what development looks like. So it would emphasize, as it does, issues around education and health, obviously, the environment, and gender that influences a lot of this as well. So it's the rights to development hasn't been fully developed it's something that's been around for a very long time, but different interpretations of development come from different countries. So the concept of the developmental state in South Africa, for example, has taken a bit of a back seat when the NDP started talking about a capable and developmental state. And there's not a very clear understanding, I think, of what the right to development encompasses. But I think all the elements that you find in the Sustainable Development Goals are those that would be included into recognition of a right to development. Then the issue of non-political human rights, well, I mean, I think human rights are political through and through. Law and politics go hand in hand with one another. Recognition of only civil and political rights comes from a liberal or neoliberal perspective. Recognition of socioeconomic rights come from a more socialist perspective. So talking about non-political human rights is a little bit inaccurate in the sense that all human rights are political in nature, and the right to development is no exception. It's a political statement, and it comes very much from China's influence. So my argument would be, no, BRICS cannot really shy away from discussing and contemplating. If they say that they're going to treat all human rights on an equal basis, then they would have to start looking at first and second generation human rights on par, not only in the international domain, but also within states. But that's controversial because, and I think this links up with Sylvester, Dr. Maposa, Dr. Sekunjani, comments about the political agenda that's developing. There is a very clear political agenda that's developing, and there is an attempt to influence local agendas. You know, one would always think, though, that things come from the bottom up. One wouldn't want to see a situation where an agenda is determined at an international, global level and then starts to influence the political agenda of the local. But I don't think that they can be separated from one another. So you can't really have a situation where there is no global influence on local politics and no local influence on global politics. I think it's a seamless, nowadays when we live in this cosmopolitan world of ours, there's this seamless interaction. And, you know, obviously some people are uncomfortable with the perceived politics of BRICS, but you have mentioned that there is also this revisionist strain. But one of the things that I think people are most suspicious about is this whole state sovereignty issue. So the state is placed as in a very powerful position within the discourse of BRICS, and of course that would then influence the power relations that are currently in existence and that will probably stay in existence.
Thank you very much. Krish or Jayad, can you please help us with some questions in Cape Town?
Any questions? No questions here?
Okay. Do we have anyone in Durban?
Behind you for the questions.
All right, Victoria will have another go.
Yeah.
Can we please start with you, Sarah, and then we'll come this way and back here again.
Sorry, thank you. It's Gerard Haag from HSRC. The declaration are international ways of expressing intent. And then obviously the next question is, are there test cases where those intentions were tested and found to be upheld, or are they in certain situations ignored?
Okay, my name is Olivia Rabukana. I'm from the ISA unit in the HSRC. My question is almost a follow-up to Gerard's question. Declarations are not necessarily binding. So as I said, you probably need a court case to bring them into to be binding. So my second question is, obviously the intention in the declarations to support human rights and international law in general is good, but will the same intentions get reflected, for instance, in a treaty establishing the BRICS, because then that would be binding on the BRICS members?
Thank you. Another question?
Yes, my name is Philemon, working in the government. I've got two questions. One is, seeing that during the presentation, you mentioned more about international order, world order. It comes more often during the presentation. Now, I'm in the middle, because we have realized that from the presentation and from the speaker here, that our United Nations Security Council is controlled by few countries. Now, I'm puzzled now, who has got the authority to instill world order or international world order? It is the different treaties, or it is through the United Nations? I'm confused there, especially because most of the countries, they are not ratified, or they don't belong to the United Security Council. Number two, it is, we're talking about justice for all in terms of human rights. Now, we've seen, we have got a document or an institution called Geneva Convention that stipulates that during the conflict zone or during war, how you must treat the areas and places to make sure that those human beings or those institutions, they are not involved in war. And out of that, there is a post-conflict reconstruction and development. Now, seeing what happened in Libya and now in Syria, are we seeing now country diverting from the Geneva Convention to avoid post-conflict reconstruction development using the name terror tactics? I'm just curious around there. Thanks.
Do we have any more questions? I think we have one question in Cape Town.
Thanks, Narnia. It's Crania.
Hello.
So you use the word in introducing your presentation, reform. You said that the approach that was being developed here in the BRICS environment was essentially a reformist one. Now, building on some of the discussion that colleagues are beginning to develop in their questions and comments, then, how when we start thinking about these concepts of the universal and universal human rights and these questions of justice, how do we begin to imagine on an international basis a development which isn't reformist? I mean, what might such a development actually consist of? You know, what are its points of departure?
Okay, I think we can maybe take two more questions and then we'll close for the day. If there is anybody else in Pretoria, we have one question here.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you again. Thank you, Prof. When you were providing a response earlier on, you talked about education. What we have seen recently in South Africa is the debate around teaching Mandarin. And so that also brings me to the question of the power relations within the BRICS, because the debate has been centralized around how come other BRICS members are not also adopting the languages from South Africa, but it's only one way. So I'm just interested if you could probably have an insight on that. Thank you, Chance.
If no one else has a question, I have one question. So for me, it seems like the rule of law comes in first place and second place and sometimes fourth place. And for maybe it isn't or isn't a coincidence where it's Brazil or South Africa or India, it probably comes in first or second place. and if it's Russia or China, it comes in 4th, 5th, 7th place. What does that say about the consistency of the organization's vision, assuming that if rule of law has a 1st place or 2nd place position or 7th place, there's something else above it which is seemingly more important, and if there is no consistency on what we might presume should be a 1st place principle, what are we kind of agreeing on, or I mean, where are we moving in terms of the consistency of the organization's vision?
Thanks.
Can I answer?
Yes. Thank you very much. Some really challenging questions. Let me try to address just a few of them. Well, not all of them, but just address them as well as I can. First of all, the issue of a declaration, I think that was Dr. Haag, is an expression of intent. And this links up with the question that was asked by Olivia. Yes, it is an expression of intent, and it's not a binding legal document. So the only way that you can look at the expression of intent is to see whether anything concrete is actually happening in terms of this vision that is being expressed by leaders. And yeah, when we look at some of the developments, the new development bank, the contingency reserve arrangements, those are manifestations of the expression of intent found in the declarations. So some of the stuff is being concretized and coming into being, so to speak. But when it comes to processes of democratization, it's far more difficult in the sense that BRICS is working within a existent structure. So they have to reform from within. They can't reform from outside. So what is happening is there's probably a lot of stuff going on, but it's not manifesting. So that intent that is being expressed is not manifesting. The only area where I think there is serious disagreement is in terms of the Security Council, and that is, but it's also made clear in the declarations that Russia and China are reluctant to see anything change radically within the Security Council. Because of the fact that they like their veto power and they like the comfort of knowing who the other 3 members are and the kind of positions that they would take. So yeah, they aren't binding, but I think that to a certain extent there has been a manifestation of some of the intent. And I think China's movement towards emphasizing the rule of law is a manifestation of the intent to some extent as well, although it's not probably related to BRICS. Then the idea of a treaty establishing BRICS is a very interesting one, but also risky in the sense that BRICS has already recognized the United Nations as a central multilateral organization internationally. So what are you doing here? You're creating something quite new, and yes, it would be legally binding, but who exactly is going to differentiate between what the United Nations position is on something and what the BRICS position is on something? I just think the centrality of the United Nations is a very good aspect of this intent that is being reflected in the declarations. The United Nations Security Council and the international world order. Yeah, I mean, the way in which the United Nations works is through conventions and treaties that countries ratify. And so there's a lot going on in the General Assembly of the United Nations that people just frankly ignore, because the sexy stuff is going on in the Security Council. And that would be obviously issues around peace and security. So as long as you have a situation where the Security Council is operating in the way it is now with the veto, nothing's going to change. And that's why the reform of the United Nations Security Council is not going to happen in the near future, in my view. Yeah, and that's linked to the question related to the Geneva Convention and the way in which civilians and etc. Well, I mean, I think this is a difficult one because I understand where the question is coming from. Simultaneously, there's a new kind of war being waged, is there not? It's a very, very difficult one. It's not countries on your borders threatening to invade you. It's something completely different. So in that sense, I think maybe the Geneva Convention is a bit outdated, and there needs to be thinking around how internationally states are going to deal with these kind of terror tactics that are happening at the moment. And it's not just good enough, I believe, to declare war and start bombing randomly, but to actually think through how people can be protected in this kind of strange war where civilians are becoming targets. Then, Ukraine, Dr. Sudin, the issue of reform and the reformist or revisionist nature of BRICS, what would the world look like if there wasn't any reform? That's, I think I understand your question like that. I don't think that we can continue with an unreformed system because of the fact that we've seen what rampant consumerism, capitalism, skewed power relations are doing to the world. So in that sense, there needs to be change and there need to be new players coming to the table, and their voices need to be heard. And BRICS claims to want to do this, and I sincerely hope that this will happen. BRICS wants to ensure that voices of emerging and developing countries are heard. That's what they are saying to some extent. So in that sense, I cannot see things going on as they are now with only a few influential players and no consideration given to the emerging and developing countries. And that's one of the more interesting elements of BRICS. Palisa, the teaching of Mandarin and your sort of linking it to power relations within BRICS, that's very interesting. Yes, our other languages. Actually, one of my Brazilian counterparts was saying to me, well, what about Portuguese? So, you know, good question. What about Portuguese? It's widely spoken and it's spoken in Africa, a slightly different version. So there is undoubtedly a power dynamic within BRICS itself. One cannot just ignore that. And China is clearly the leader of the pack in that regard. And obviously, China is going to use BRICS for its own purposes. We all do that. You know, national interests influence our conduct on the international stage. And so China will continue to push this cultural aspect of soft power. And we just have to sort of, in a sense, as South Africa, the smallest member, push back. And, you know, we say that we want to be in BRICS because we want to push an African agenda. So that will strengthen South Africa's voice within BRICS as well, if we are also speaking to a certain extent for a continent, although that's very, very risky. I do realize that. So I think hopefully I've addressed most of the questions that were asked.
Thank you very much. Felt like an audience member there. Thank you very much for attending our seminar today. As it is our last seminar, it doesn't mean it's the last forever. We're going to start up again next year. We'll have a range of very interesting topics coming up. So please look out for our invitations. Thank you very much, Professor Bohler Muller, for presenting to us today. And thank you for attending. We have some refreshments outside. for everyone. And if you have any questions, please feel free to stick around. Thank you very much.
Yeah, on time.
Going on. Yeah. The HSRC review.
Yes.
Which journal?
July, September.
Okay.